The envelope arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning. Pale ivory with gold embossing, it stood out among the usual bills and junk mail. My name, Margaret Holloway, was written in neat cursive across the front. I held it in my hands for a moment, heart fluttering. It had finally come. The wedding invitation. I peeled it open carefully. Inside was a beautifully printed card with details of the ceremony. Thomas Holloway and Charlotte Evans request the pleasure of your company on their wedding day. The date was just 2 weeks away, the venue a grand hall in Notting Hill. I smiled, though the corners of my mouth didn't quite lift the way they used to. I hadn't been involved in the planning. No discussions, no fittings, no mother of the groom luncheon. Just this card. I looked over at the framed photo of Thomas on the mantelpiece. He was 10 years old, gap-toothed and grinning, holding up a goldfish he had won at a fair. It felt like yesterday. Now he was marrying Charlotte, the elegant daughter of a well-connected family. A family who, from the very beginning, had made me feel like I did not belong. I told myself it didn't matter. I would be there. I would smile. I would be proud. But a faint unease crept in as I tucked the card back into its envelope. Something about the whole thing felt formal, distant, like I was being invited to a public event, not my own son's wedding. I brushed the thought away. Maybe I was overthinking. Maybe Charlotte was just the type to handle things a certain way. Maybe Thomas had been too busy. Still, as I made myself a cup of tea, the question gnawed at the back of my mind. Why had it all felt so cold? The shops along Oxford Street were glowing with warm lights and summer displays, but I felt a chill as I stepped out of the boutique. The dress in my hands was elegant, deep navy with a soft lace trim, modest, timeless. It was the kind of dress a mother should wear to her son's wedding. I held it up to the light. It looked lovely, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had picked it out for a stranger's celebration. I had asked Thomas once, weeks ago, if Charlotte had any color preferences for the family outfits. He had replied in a text, "No idea. Ask her." So I did. I messaged Charlotte politely, suggesting a few options and asking what might work best. She responded with a single sentence 2 days later. "Whatever you're comfortable in is fine." No greeting. No warmth. It was clear from that moment on that I was not meant to be part of the picture. Back home, I hung the dress neatly in the wardrobe and sat at the kitchen table in silence. The kettle boiled behind me, but I didn't move. I stared at the wall clock as the seconds ticked on. When did the distance begin? Was it when Thomas got engaged? Or before that, when he moved into Charlotte's family's townhouse near Kensington and stopped calling as often? There had been a time when he phoned me every Sunday, without fail. He would tell me about work, friends, even what he had for dinner. That had slowly faded away. Now our conversations were brief, as if I were just another obligation he had to tick off his list. The day of the rehearsal dinner approached. I hadn't received an invitation to that. Apparently, it was a close circle only. Thomas apologized over the phone, his voice light and hurried. "It's just how Charlotte's family planned it. Nothing personal, Mum. Nothing personal." But it felt deeply personal. It felt like I was being erased, inch by inch, from the most important day of my son's life. Still, I told myself again I would go. I would hold my head high, no matter how invisible they made me feel. The morning of the wedding dawned with skies the color of wet slate. Light rain tapped against my window as I sipped my tea in silence. I had barely slept. A tightness had taken root in my chest, something between anticipation and quiet dread. I dressed slowly, brushing my hair with extra care. The navy dress fit well, the lace resting gently against my collarbone. I added a silver brooch Thomas had given me for my 50th birthday, a small bird in flight. It brought back better memories. Lighter days. By 10, I was in the back seat of a black cab, clutching my handbag as we drove towards Notting Hill. The streets were slick, lined with trees in full green. People in smart clothes walked with umbrellas in hand, all heading somewhere with purpose. The venue came into view, a grand Georgian building with towering white columns and wide stone steps. As I stepped out, I paused a moment, watching the other guests streaming in. Laughter echoed near the entrance, champagne glasses already clinking. I walked up the steps and gave my name at the front. The young man checking the list barely looked at me. Margaret Holloway, ah yes. You're seated at table 11. His voice was flat, uninterested. He handed me a small card and waved me in. Inside, the room was glowing with candles and white flowers. Charlotte's family moved through the space like royalty. Her mother, slender in a cream silk suit, was greeting guests with perfect ease. I looked around for Thomas. I didn't see him. A woman approached me. I recognized her vaguely. One of Charlotte's aunts, perhaps. Oh, you're the groom's mother? How lovely. You must be so proud. Yes, I said softly, forcing a smile. Very proud. She nodded, already looking past me. I made my way to table 11. It was at the very back, near the doors that led to the kitchen. My name was written in small letters on a single card, placed beside a floral centerpiece that had started to wilt. I sat down slowly, trying not to show how hard my heart was pounding. I watched as other guests found their places. Charlotte's parents were at the front, near the aisle. Her cousins filled the central rows. I counted again, 11 tables, and I was at the very last one. I told myself it didn't matter. But it did. When the music started and Charlotte began her walk down the aisle, everyone rose and turned to look at her. She was radiant, wrapped in satin and lace, smiling like a woman who knew the world belonged to her. Thomas stood at the altar, eyes fixed on her, glowing with joy. No one looked at me. Not once. The ceremony passed in a blur. I clapped politely, stood when I was supposed to, smiled for the photos, and nodded when strangers approached to offer pleasantries. But none of it felt real. It was like watching a film, one in which I had no role, only a seat at the back. After the confetti had settled and the newlyweds drove off in a vintage car for photos, the guests were ushered into the reception hall. The smell of roasted meat and rich sauces filled the air. Laughter echoed beneath the chandeliers. I followed the crowd to the tables, feeling more like a guest than the groom's mother. At table 11, no one greeted me. The chairs filled slowly with distant acquaintances and extended relatives of Charlotte's, none of whom seemed to know who I was. They smiled politely and turned back to their conversations. When the starters were served, my plate didn't arrive. I waited, glancing around. Everyone else at my table had a small dish of smoked salmon or goat's cheese tart. I flagged down a waiter. "Excuse me, I think my plate was missed." He looked at me, puzzled. "You're at table 11, right? I'll check." 10 minutes passed. The others were finishing their food when he finally returned, carrying a plate. He set it down without a word. It was cold. The salmon had lost its shine. The lemon slice had dried. I stared at it for a long time, my appetite gone. Main course came next, roast chicken with vegetables and gravy. Again, my plate was delayed. When it arrived, it was barely warm. The vegetables were soft and gray. I forced myself to eat 2 bites. Across the room, I could see Thomas and Charlotte seated at the head table, laughing with her parents and bridal party. Charlotte glanced around once and caught my eye. She smiled faintly, gave a small wave, then turned back to her friends. I raised my glass and pretended not to care. But something inside me snapped in that moment. Not in anger, no, something deeper than that. A hollow, aching kind of hurt. This wasn't an oversight. This wasn't a mistake. I was being excluded. Quietly, elegantly, deliberately. The speeches began after the dessert was served. I had barely touched mine, a lemon tart with cream that tasted of nothing. I stirred my coffee absently, my eyes fixed on the front of the hall. Charlotte's father stood first. He was charming, confident, the kind of man who filled a room without raising his voice. He spoke warmly of his daughter's childhood, of her kindness, her ambition, her elegance. The guests chuckled and nodded. He then welcomed Thomas into their family with a grace that sounded rehearsed but heartfelt. "And of course," he said, lifting his glass, "we thank all of you for being here today, especially those who traveled from afar and the family who raised such a fine young man." He didn't say my name. He didn't even look in my direction. The applause filled the room anyway. Thomas's best friend gave the next speech. It was lively, full of inside jokes from university days. There were shouts of laughter from the head table. I tried to laugh along, but the jokes didn't land for me. I wasn't part of that chapter of his life anymore. Then Thomas stood. My breath caught. He began with a few kind words about Charlotte, how she made him a better man, how lucky he was. He thanked her parents, her sisters, her friends. Each name, each word, carried weight and affection. Finally, he said, and to my mom, thank you for everything. For your support, your love, and, well, for putting up with me all these years. A few chuckles followed. It was short, quick, like a tick on a checklist. I smiled, clapped with everyone else, but I felt my face freeze. That was it? After everything? A woman seated across from me leaned towards her friend, barely whispering. That must be her. The mother. I heard she wasn't really involved in the planning. Oh, the other woman said, sipping her wine. That explains the seating. I looked down at my lap, fingers clenched around my napkin. So the whispers had already begun. I wasn't imagining it. People noticed. They saw where I sat, how I was treated. They saw I didn't belong. And yet, not one person said it to my face. Not even Thomas. The band started to play soft jazz, and the tables began to clear as guests moved to the dance floor. The newlyweds twirled under fairy lights while photographers snapped endlessly, capturing moments that would be printed and framed. I remained seated. No one came to fetch me. No one asked me to dance. From afar, I watched Thomas spin Charlotte effortlessly, her laughter echoing through the room. His eyes never left hers. He looked happy. Truly happy. I couldn't bring myself to resent that. But something about that joy, so distant from me, stung more than I expected. Eventually, a server came around offering coffee refills. I took one, only to have him return a moment later and say, "Apologies, madam. That was meant for someone else." He took the cup from my hand before I'd even had a sip. I stared at the empty space on the table where it had been. All around me, the conversations carried on: holiday plans, school news, London traffic. I sat in silence, the music in my ears like a distant hum. Someone beside me made a toast. Another guest laughed too loudly. The world moved around me, but never towards me. I stood up. No one noticed. I walked out of the reception hall and into the cool corridor. The quiet was sudden and soothing. A long mirror stretched across one wall. I caught my reflection. Neat hair, carefully applied lipstick, the brooch still shining. But the woman in the mirror looked tired. Hollow. I walked down the corridor until I found a door marked Garden Terrace. I pushed it open. Outside, the air was sharp and fresh. A string of lanterns lined the iron railing, casting a soft glow across the stones. I sat on a bench, listening to the muffled laughter from inside. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I just sat. Somewhere behind me, a door creaked open. I didn't turn around. Then a voice, light, hesitant, spoke. "Are you all right?" I looked up. It was one of Charlotte's cousins, a girl no older than 20. She stood in her heels, hugging a coat to her chest. I just wanted to say," she stammered, "I think you look really elegant tonight." I managed a smile. "Thank you." She gave a shy nod and turned back inside. It wasn't much, just a sliver of kindness. But in that moment, it meant everything. Days passed. The celebration faded into memory, at least for everyone else. For me, the sting lingered. I returned to my flat in Hackney, surrounded by silence. No more appointments, no florists, no phone calls from Charlotte's mother triple-checking logistics. No messages from Thomas either. Just quiet, the kind that echoed. I busied myself with the small things. Folding laundry, rearranging the spice rack, watering the window plants. But my mind kept returning to that hall, that table, that cold salmon. Then one morning, the post arrived. Among the usual bills and flyers was a thick white envelope with gold lettering. My fingers hesitated before opening it. Inside was the official wedding album. A note fell out with neat, curly handwriting. "Thank you again for coming. We hope these memories bring you joy. Love, Charlotte and Thomas. I opened the album slowly. The first page showed Thomas in a tailored navy suit, beaming with pride. Charlotte stood beside him, her dress glittering under the spring sun, holding a bouquet of pale roses. They looked stunning.
Picture perfect.
Page after page captured the laughter, the elegance, the speeches. Friends clinking glasses, bridesmaids fixing veils, children running through the garden. I looked for myself. I wasn't on the first few pages. Or the next few. Eventually, I found a photo of Table 11. I was there in the corner of the frame, head slightly turned, as if I didn't belong in the scene. My smile was faint, my posture tense. Later, I found another shot, me in the background, walking alone in the corridor.
Blurred.
Out of focus. There was no picture of me with the bride and groom. No portrait. No posed smile. I hadn't been asked. I closed the album and placed it on the table. It wasn't anger that followed. It wasn't even sadness. It was something colder. Like watching your old family home being sold and repainted, your memories stripped from the walls. For a while, I sat still. Then I stood up, went to the cabinet, and pulled out my own photo albums. Old birthdays. School concerts. A camping trip in Devon where Thomas lost a shoe in the river, and we laughed so hard we forgot the rain. Those memories were real. Unstaged.
Ours.
And suddenly I knew something. This new chapter in his life didn't include me. Not really. Not because I'd done something wrong, but because he no longer needed me to be the main character in his story. Spring turned to summer. The city grew louder, brighter, full of outdoor cafes and sun-drenched parks. But inside my flat, things remained still. I didn't hear from Thomas, not even a message asking how I was. The silence settled like dust in the corners of my home. I found myself walking more. Through Regent's Park, down by the canals in Little Venice, sometimes across to Hampstead Heath. I passed mothers pushing prams, elderly couples holding hands, young lovers sprawled on the grass. The world moved with purpose. One Sunday, I stepped into a charity bookshop near Camden. Rows of old hardbacks, the scent of aging paper, and a faint melody from the radio overhead. It felt like a place untouched by time. I wandered between shelves until I found a worn copy of A Room of One's Own. I smiled. It had been one of my favorites at university. As I waited at the till, I noticed a young couple browsing nearby. They looked newly married. Their fingers brushed as they laughed over a novel with a ridiculous title. I turned away quickly. Outside, I paused on the pavement. There was no bitterness, just a sharp awareness that my world had shifted. Not broken, just reassembled. Without Thomas at its center, I made my way to the bus stop and sat with the book in my lap. 2 stops later, an older woman boarded. She had soft gray curls and carried a bouquet of peonies. She sat beside me and smiled kindly. "Lovely weather," she said. I nodded. "It is." She glanced down at the book on my lap. Wolf. I used to read her on rainy evenings. Before my daughter moved out, we'd read aloud together. Now it's just me. I offered a small smile. I know the feeling. We spoke gently for a while. Not about loss or loneliness, but about favorite authors, secondhand books, and the way peonies always wilt faster than you expect. When I got home, I placed the book on my bedside table. Then I sat at my desk and pulled out a piece of paper. I didn't write a letter to Thomas. I wrote one to myself. I wrote about the things I had endured, about how proud I was for showing up, even when it hurt, about how grace I was learning often looked like quiet dignity, not a grand gesture, but the decision to keep moving forward. I folded the letter and placed it inside the book. For safekeeping. Weeks later, I received another invitation. This time, it was for Charlotte's birthday lunch, a garden party at her parents' home in Richmond. I stared at the envelope on my kitchen counter for days before finally opening it. Inside, the card was elegant, soft green with gold foil lettering, and beneath the polite message, a note scribbled by Charlotte herself. "Would love for you to be there. Bring your stories. We miss your laugh." I didn't know what to feel. There was warmth in her words, yes, but also a peculiar distance, as if I had become a guest in a place where I once felt at home. The day arrived with blue skies and the scent of early roses in bloom. I chose a linen dress and a wide-brimmed hat, something that said effortless grace, even if I didn't feel it. As I stepped into the garden, I was greeted with nods and smiles, light chatter floating on the breeze. Charlotte spotted me from across the lawn and waved with enthusiasm. She made her way over, hugging me tightly. "I'm so glad you came," she said. "You look lovely," I replied, meaning it. She introduced me to a few new faces, colleagues from her publishing job, a couple from her honeymoon trip, someone who taught yoga in Notting Hill. It was polite. It was fine. But it wasn't what it had been. As we all sat down to eat, I noticed something. One chair at the long table had been left empty. It wasn't an oversight. It was deliberate, set with a plate, a glass, and a folded napkin. Charlotte caught my gaze and leaned in. "That's for you," she whispered with a smile. "I saved it just in case you were late." I sat. The food was better this time. Crisp asparagus tart, fresh strawberries, lemonade that fizzed gently in the sunlight. The conversation swirled around me, and though I joined in, I never truly felt immersed. At one point, Thomas arrived. He kissed Charlotte's cheek, nodded at a few guests, then noticed me. His smile faltered just slightly before returning to form. We exchanged a polite hello. That was all. The sun dipped lower in the sky. The laughter grew louder. But I felt no urge to stay. I thanked Charlotte, excused myself early, and walked back to the train station. As I sat by the window, watching the trees blur past, I realized something. That empty chair hadn't been for me. It had been a symbol, a placeholder, a polite gesture meant to acknowledge a space I no longer filled. It was autumn when I found it. A small studio tucked above a flower shop in Primrose Hill. It had creaky floorboards, faded curtains, and a window that caught the sunset in just the right way. The landlady, a woman in her 70s with sharp eyes and kind hands, called it charming in an old soul sort of way. I agreed. I moved in with only a few boxes, books, linens, a chipped mug Thomas once gave me, though I wasn't sure why I kept it. Maybe as a reminder that people, like objects, can become worn, yet still hold weight. Life became quieter.
Softer.
I cooked simple meals, listened to radio plays, and walked down to the bakery every morning for a croissant and a nod from the boy behind the counter. No one expected anything of me here. No long histories, no strained smiles. Just fresh air and space. One Sunday afternoon, I sat at the window, watching leaves twist down from the trees like gold confetti. I sipped tea and let the stillness settle. That's when I finally let myself cry. Not from pain, but from release. From finally admitting that I had been grieving something that wasn't just about a wedding or a cold plate of food. It was about all the years I had poured into someone else's life, believing that love, real love, would always recognize and repay loyalty. But life doesn't follow such scripts. And sometimes, closure doesn't come from apologies or explanations. Sometimes, it's a quiet moment alone with your own truth. I stood and picked up a small canvas. It had been blank for months. I set it on the easel, dipped a brush into the paint, and let my hand move. No plan. No expectation. Just color meeting space. I painted until the sun disappeared behind the rooftops. That night, as I lay beneath the soft hush of this new place, I didn't think of Thomas, or Charlotte, or that table or that plate. I thought of how far I had come, not because I had fought, but because I had let go. And for the first time in a long while, I fell asleep smiling.